Greetings everyone, warm welcome. It is an honour to have you here at the Saphira Centre of Shamanism, where we break down the ancient esoteric practices of shamanism and the occult, bringing them into balance with the deep psyche. My name is Luke, experienced practitioner and mentor of the shamanic and occult sciences. As always, it is an honour to have you here. Be sure to check out my Patreon within the first link of the description of this video if you want access to my powerful exclusive content relating to the advanced occult sciences. You will find all kinds of initiatory systems, path workings, invocations, initiations, transmissions, meditations, guided journeys, and all kinds of things on this Patreon, catering for different levels. You will find all things from beginner's attunements to expand your vessel, to train your system to hold advanced occult energy, to trauma integration work, as well as full initiatory systems through the Sephiroth, the Tree of Life, the Cliffoth, the Tree of Death, and many other things as well. Access starts at just £20 per month, and there are loads of tiers that you can choose from that grant you different levels of access to me, different levels of exclusive content, including webinars and initiations and one-on-one mentoring for tier 3 and higher. Be sure to check that out. I look forward to seeing you there. So today we are going to be discussing a big trap within one's evolutionary path. I see this playing out a lot. I've also had experience of falling into this myself. We're going to be discussing the narcissistic bubble. Now, a narcissistic bubble is one of the most fascinating things because of how fluid and adaptable it is according to the individual. A narcissistic bubble is essentially a set of perceptual filters that are established within a person's psyche to stop them from perceiving things that they have learnt is not safe to perceive. But in doing so, they limit their own evolution. Now, what these perceptual filters do is that they are built in order to respond to traumatic experiences from the past, normally traumatic experiences whereby they have been severely hurt physically or emotionally, or they have been shut down at some capacity. This causes an identity structure to form around this trauma that then keeps the person separated from challenging or triggering experiences. This then creates the false persona and false narrative of safety, but in reality they are only living their life in order to avoid challenging experiences and maintain this false sense of self-image. It is a massive subject because it is extremely common within many different areas. You see this playing out with people who are in the spiritual community, within the healing world, those who are just doing this work to try and feel good or trying to maintain this state of feeling good or maintaining this high vibrational state. You see it a lot within the New Age spiritual community with people wanting to avoid low vibe people, avoid negativity, avoid negative energies, avoid darkness, and all types of things like that. You also see it playing out within many religious people as well, with the attachment to false light and the maintenance of this false light and false sense of security, but total bypassing, but also identification with what they are avoiding. You also see this playing out within the occult community, particularly the darker aspects of the occult community, with people who want to try and maintain this image of being a magician, being a magus, being a black magician, but in reality inside is just a scared, powerless child that is trying to in some way justify its self-value and sense of self through a title, mask, or role that it has learnt is safe to identify with. You see this a lot as well with people who have experienced a lot of relational trauma, whereby they have been emotionally shut down, physically abused, or shut down within relationship dynamics. This can often create a very dense separation consciousness where the person creates the narrative that they don't need intimacy, that they don't need anybody. They create the persona of the loner or the hermit. But in reality, this is just built to avoid triggers and avoid challenging experiences, and to be honest with you, it's built to avoid accountability as a whole. We refer to this as a narcissistic bubble simply because it is a self-created illusion that is there to maintain a massive illusion of grandeur. So this is what we are going to be discussing today. We're going to be looking at some of the examples, some of the different ways in which a narcissistic bubble can be cultivated, how it plays out, and how you can know if you have fallen into a narcissistic bubble yourself. Absolutely essential topic, so definitely stay tuned. So the narcissistic bubble is fascinating, but in order to understand it fully, we first need to look into what perceptual filtering is. Now, perceptual filtering is a psychological concept which is built off of the idea that the psyche is multiplicious and made up of various filters or thought forms that are established to act as husks or shells that encase the person's perception. In other words, these are protective parts that are built to keep a person safe from things that they have learnt are not safe to perceive about themselves and about the world that they live in. Our conscious mind is only a beam of awareness within an abyss of pure potential. The abyss of pure potential being our unconscious mind, the vast landscape of what is unseen or neglected within self. The subconscious mind can be seen as the net, the area of grey matter that holds various perceptual filters that stop your conscious mind from perceiving things within your unconscious mind that it has learned is not safe to perceive. In other words, the reality that you are perceiving now is only the reality that you feel safe to perceive according to these perceptual filters. Now, these perceptual filters are established from the moment we experience pain for the very first time. Pain constitutes anything, be that physical or emotional, whereby we do not have our needs met. It manifests in early years as the very simple, I like this, I don't like that. And we learn very quickly what pain really is. From the moment we experience pain, we experience a separation from the true enthusiasm of our soul, and that cultivates a set of emotions that are suppressed along a sliding scale. Now, I'm not going to be speaking in this video about the process of emotional suppression in detail because I have made a video specifically on that. Definitely check that out. But our emotions are suppressed along a sliding scale, along a spectrum, from the moment we experience pain. And pain is right at the top of that threshold. In other words, it is the very first thing that triggers suppression because we do not know how to actually feel and embrace pain, and we don't actually have the aspect of the psyche fully developed yet, that being the ego, that is there to basically separate us from pain. So from the moment we experience pain, we have to suppress it, and when we suppress pain, it cultivates a series of other emotions. When pain is suppressed, it cultivates anger because our needs are not being met. When anger is suppressed, it cultivates fear because we believe that nothing is going to change. When fear is suppressed, it cultivates grief that sits within the solar plexus. When we suppress grief, we go into apathy because we believe that nothing is going to change. And when we suppress apathy, we go into dissociation and unconsciousness and don't even realize that there is a problem in the first place. This is how emotional suppression works, and it starts from the very moment that we experience pain within our early years, because we do not have the capacity to effectively process emotions that we perceive as not desired, alongside the societal conditioning as to what is good, what is bad, as well as our individual trauma fragmentation. So, as these emotions are suppressed, they form literal protective mechanisms within the psyche that are established to stop us from feeling that pain. It's absolutely remarkable what the psyche does and what it is able to do. So, in other words, our sense of self is then established in a way that by default is built to avoid pain. Now, this creates the collective narcissistic bubble because we learn according to our conditioning and according to what we have learnt is safe versus not safe to feel, we learn that we have to attain this primary sense of self. We learn that we have to strive towards this state of feeling good or towards this state of feeling enough, normally defined by external things, defined by external output. And that causes us to then cycle within continuous lack. This is how the narcissistic bubble plays out within the collective consciousness. It basically keeps you within a space whereby you have to maintain this sense of self that was built from a false purpose in the first place. You have to maintain this sense of self that was built to keep you separated from your emotions. At which point, this is how the collective functions. Everything in our lives becomes a tool to feed this predefined sense of self, this predefined set of perceptual filters that are there only to maintain an illusion and keep us separated from what is actually there. Now, what we are being separated from is not only pain, but it is also power. It is also potential. It is also authenticity, true self-expression, and true and authentic sovereignty. So the narcissistic bubble is built to keep a person separated from challenging things, from painful things, from things that trigger the ego and challenge the ego, but also things that are there to prompt the ego into continuous growth. The narcissistic bubble creates the illusion that reality and identity is singular. It creates the illusion that you have to reach this primary state of consciousness, and then once you're there, then you have attained what it is that you need. Now, there is no bigger trap when it comes to one's evolution simply because evolution is fluid. It's ongoing. It continuously flows within that spiral-like nature. It is not a linear thing. The narcissistic bubble creates the illusion of linearity and therefore causes individuals to see this primary state that they are striving towards as the totality of reality. When we do that, we keep ourselves separated from our evolution, and we end up living this life of stagnation that we actually think is what we need to evolve. The way that we see this playing out a lot, or that I see this playing out a lot, is, as I've mentioned, within the spiritual community, within the therapeutic community. Most people who go into therapy are going into it from this linear mindset of needing to feel better, and therefore the entire therapeutic community is established from a space of basically applying a series of coping mechanisms to try and help a person reach this linear state of feeling good. But little do many people know that if you are in a state of feeling good all of the time, then you are not actually growing at all as a person. If you are in a state whereby you are constantly in this space of feeling good, you are in a narcissistic bubble. Because evolution comes from embracing the fluidity of emotions, and it comes from understanding that emotions are not individual singular concepts, but are a spectrum that is there to be moved along according to what it is that you are feeling within you. So when you welcome a given feeling, particularly when it is a heavy feeling or a heavy emotion, when you're welcoming that and actually looking at it, it is naturally going to transition into something else, likely something deeper and more painful, because when you're actually facing the emotions that you are avoiding, you are doing the opposite to the suppression process. In other words, you are moving up the opposite way, moving through those different emotions, getting to deeper and stronger and more unpleasant emotions to feel. But when you do that, you are actually liberating yourself in the process. So to put it simply, a narcissistic bubble is a set of perceptual filters that are established to avoid accountability. Therefore, anything has the potential to become a narcissistic bubble. Now, understand that narcissistic bubbles are built through pain and pain alone. Therefore, if somebody is in that constant state of I'm feeling good all of the time, or I need to feel good all of the time, they are bypassing the polarity. Okay, light cannot exist without its dark counterpart. Sacred geometry of order is fluid and constantly moving because of the dark matter that deconstructs its illusionary construct and its outdated formats so that it can continue to grow. In other words, you need to cycle between death and rebirth, masculine and feminine, creation and destruction, in order to evolve. Whereas the linear world around us, that is built from the very simple concept of suppressing pain and trying to avoid things that are unpleasant, it creates the illusion that you have to reach this point and then that is it. But when you are on a real process of evolution, everything is impermanent. Nothing remains the same. No state of consciousness will ever remain the same. Nothing. No state of euphoria will ever remain the same. No state of understanding will ever remain the same. And would you want it to remain the same, realistically speaking? When you understand that everything is a spectrum and soul evolution and integration comes in a fluid way, a balance between death and rebirth, darkness and light, would you want things to stay the same? If you have developed an understanding of yourself, do you want that understanding to remain completely solid? Or do you want it to grow? Do you want it to adapt? Do you want it to become something bigger, better, and more expansive? You see this a lot within the concept of shadow work and individuation, where people reach a state of self-understanding, understanding oneself in some way, and then they see that as the total truth. I am who I am. At which point, they're using that piece of information that they have just gained to feed their narcissistic bubble. Another example is when you see somebody who is reading loads of books, accumulating all of this knowledge and information, but is using the story of the book to identify with. They're not using the story of the book to actually fuel their ongoing evolution and just use it as a different perspective, but they're using it as a mechanism to hide from themselves. You see this a lot within people who are following different spiritual teachers with no discernment. They're basically eating what they are given without questioning it in any way whatsoever. At which point there is no sovereignty in that, and that piece of information is then being used to continuously regurgitate in order to support that individual's sense of self without rupturing the sense of self. Real teachings and real sustainable teachings should not enforce your sense of self. They should rupture your sense of self. If you have a spiritual teacher that validates everything that you say, that teacher is doing you a disservice. If you have a spiritual teacher that ruptures your reality as you know it, that ruptures your ego, that challenges your ego. That is for your evolutionary best interest, because that is what your soul needs to evolve. So you need to be challenged in order to grow. You need to have your ego constantly challenged. You need to have your sense of self constantly ruptured in order to keep growing as a person. Now, when I say not needing validation, I am referring to the validation of a person's coping mechanisms and the validation of a person's predefined sense of self. In other words, anything that validates a person's narcissistic bubble. For example, somebody is in a victim space and they're blaming other people, then an example of a teacher that would then validate that individual is if the teacher says, yes, you are the victim and you need to learn how to fight back. You see this a lot within the spiritual community. You need to learn to fight back. Okay, fight back against your oppressors. Fight back against the archons. Fight back against the curses. Okay, we are victims. That is validation of the falsehood. Whereas the challenge there would be to actually see beyond it, to see beyond that predefined reality. So you see yourself as a victim. Understand why. Understand by blaming that individual. Are you identifying with that individual's story? In the majority of cases, yes. So in order to keep growing, you have to have your ego ruptured in some capacity. Now, it's different having your inner child validated and your ego validated. Okay, when your ego is being validated, your protective mechanisms and vehicles of separation are being validated, which, by the way, is always going to feel very comfortable. When you are being validated in a way that is reinforcing your coping mechanisms and reinforcing your protective parts, it's going to feel very satisfying. But when you're having your inner child validated, you are having your true sense of self-expression validated. In other words, teachings that are rupturing your protector parts are actually validating your inner child. They are validating your inner child and validating your true sense of self-expression, which is always going to feel more uncomfortable because you are embodying a teaching that is beyond the constraints of what you have learnt is safe to perceive. In other words, you are embodying a teaching that is beyond your narcissistic bubble. Now, the narcissistic bubble you can see now is an immense trap, particularly when it comes through the illusion of healing and integration. Okay, the notion that I am healed because I am a therapist. I am healed because I have reached this point in my process. I am healed because I've completed this initiation. I am healed because I am a shaman now. I am healed because I am a black magician now. All of these are just stories. They're just stories that we are then using to fuel our sense of self more. And there is no bigger narcissistic bubble than that. Now, for myself, the narcissistic bubble played out in many different ways. It played out in demanding a resonant story to identify with. In other words, I needed something linear to strive towards. This is in the earlier part of my spiritual path, of my healing path. And it also played out in the form of feeling like I don't need anybody around me in terms of intimate partnerships. Okay, now this is very, very common for people who have experienced relational trauma, myself included. When we experience relational trauma, we experience being shut down emotionally, and then we learn to associate intimacy with pain. At which point, our narcissistic bubble, our perceptual filters are built to scapegoat intimacy. So then we blame other people unconsciously for our pain. So then we learn that we have to keep ourselves separated. So then we build the narcissistic bubble out of the simple concept of feeling like we don't need anybody, or feeling like relationships restrict us in some way, feeling trapped within relationship dynamics. Little do we know, we are bypassing and completely neglecting a core human need, a core need of the soul, which is connection. At which point we then use our identification with pain, and we use the concept of connecting and associating intimate partnership and other people with pain. So then we use that as a reason to fall into deeper levels of separation consciousness, and in doing so deprive the inner child of its basic needs. Now, the inner child is going to want to experience the opposite of the core trauma that was experienced. If you watch my channel a lot, this should be second nature by now. The inner child is the purest expression of the soul, the true will, and therefore the true will / inner child is going to want the opposite. So if you were abused as a child, or if you were shut down as a child, then it's going to want validation for the opposite. In other words, it's going to want to feel like it's enough. It's going to want to experience a connection or a share of connections, friendships, romantic partnerships, whatever that may be, that are going to provide it with the space to express itself. But this gets deprived within a narcissistic bubble because the narcissistic bubble associates people with pain and therefore tries to maintain this narrative that it doesn't need anybody, when really all it's doing is completely severing any challenge to the ego. It's so easy, so easy to keep people at arm's length. It really is. It's easy to keep people at arm's length because people represent mirrors of your psyche. People represent mirrors of what you are avoiding. So keeping people away is much easier and maintains your narcissistic bubble. Now, this is not to be confused with needing solitude. Okay, needing solitude for processing is natural. But how do you discern whether solitude is feeding your narcissistic bubble or not? Simple question. Are you using it to avoid accountability? Okay, and what the narcissistic bubble will do is it will say, no, I'm not using it to avoid accountability. Okay, the intention is one thing, but the true intention is always revealed by your action. When do you feel called to go into solitude? When do you feel called to go into hermit mode? When do you learn to basically move back into hiding? And then in many cases, you will identify how you are choosing solitude, not because your soul actually needs solitude, but because you are trying to avoid the same pain and the same trauma from your past. Now, breaking the narcissistic bubble is immensely painful. It is very painful. Okay, very painful. We are talking about rupturing the shell of our existence here. We are talking about essentially pulling a person out of a predefined matrix. That is what shattering the narcissistic bubble is. It is pulling them out of that illusion as to who they think they are and into a reality which is far more vast, and on the surface to the ego will be perceived as more volatile because you cannot see the result. You cannot see what is directly ahead of you. And you have to soften and become vulnerable and improve your connection to your heart and your inner child if you are to operate within a reality that is not linear, within a reality that is truly aligned to your soul. So the separation consciousness is very, very common. Okay, this is the literal narcissistic bubble. Okay, with people who have experienced relational trauma, avoiding connection, avoiding intimate connection, and then creating the notion that they don't need anybody. That is the most common one. Okay, and then everything you do becomes a mechanism to feed your identity as a loner. I don't need anybody. To feed your identity as a hermit. I don't need anybody. Then we have the feeling good one. Okay, this state of feeling good that we need to maintain. Okay, in other words, I'm doing so well on my own. I'm doing so well. I really feel like I'm in my power. At which point, you're avoiding triggers in order to maintain this state of feeling good. But where's the evolution in that? In other words, you are attaching to this stagnant state of consciousness. You are attaching to stagnancy and framing it as evolution and healing. But in reality, all you're doing is limiting your own evolution and limiting your own integration. You see it with light workers who are like, okay, I just need to feel good. Okay, I'm feeling good all of the time. Yeah, I need to do everything to just maintain this true sense of self. Or I want to stay away from that person because they're bad for my vibration. I want to stay away from that person because they're bad for my vibration. Okay, what the narcissistic bubble also does is literally projects and refuses accountability that way. Okay, so it's like, oh, if I'm avoiding that low vibrational person, then I am avoiding that aspect within myself. You see it all the time, okay? People who are in a narcissistic bubble often call other people narcissists. They're a narcissist, that person's a narcissist because they're serving themselves. But they're refusing the mirror that they need to serve themselves more. And what does serving yourself actually mean? It means stepping outside of your narcissistic bubble. It means stepping outside of your illusion of separation and actually learning how to serve the inner child. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Okay, in order to truly serve the self, the narcissistic bubble that keeps you in separation from your emotions and from continuous evolution has to be broken. Has to be broken in order to move you back into touch with your needs. And then you can tailor your life to meeting your needs. And that is evolution, because the whole point of this is that we have learnt that our emotional needs will not be met, and that concept of unmet needs has been completely normalized within the world around us. So then we have to build this sense of self around these unmet needs, and that is the narcissistic bubble. So yes, with light workers, you'll see it playing out in the way of trying to maintain this high vibrational state. Okay, the classic pictures of people like that. Okay, I am Arcturian starseed. Okay, I am maintaining my high vibrational state. When it's just trying to create the persona that I am feeling good as I am, but really you are holding yourself captive to your own darkness. So if you've hit this point in your process where you feel like you are in your power, congratulations, enjoy it. But are you attaching to that state? Are you attaching to the state of consciousness? I feel like I am in my power and I've done what this healing path has. I've done what the core reason why I've gone into this healing path in the first place. I have done it. But then there's no evolution in that state. There is no evolution at all within that predefined state of consciousness, because it's just an attempt to maintain one's sense of self because taking accountability is too unsafe. Then you have the religious community, which do the same thing as the light workers do. The religious community scapegoating everything that is unknown, everything that scares them, calling it the devil, calling it hell, but therefore moving it more into their reality because they're identifying with it. So then they create this notion, this narcissistic bubble, and this immense persona of righteousness. And they think, I am the righteous man because I am keeping what I am avoiding at bay. I am the righteous man. There is no bigger narcissistic bubble than that. Then you have the occult community, the darker aspects of the occult. Most practitioners within the darker aspects of the occult are in a narcissistic bubble themselves because they use this as a reason to perceive themselves more as separate, because they deep down feel immensely powerless. So then they have to find this role to attach to for a sense of self-importance. The classic is the black magician who is threatening to curse people. The classic is the black magician who is caught in this immense space of fear. The inner child is terrified. So then they try and move into this role whereby they are feared. It's exactly the same as like a gangster or something like that. Yeah, somebody who wants to be a roadman or a gangster, it's exactly the same concept. Okay, they want to be feared because the inner child is terrified inside. And it's the same with somebody who wants to be a black magician, somebody who wants to be feared in this way, somebody who wants to be seen as all great and powerful. It's also the case when somebody wants to be a shaman. Okay, the word shaman flying around the New Age community like crazy. Everybody is a shaman now, apparently. Okay, the person down the street has just become a shaman because they just did a weekend course, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a greater mechanism to feed this narcissistic bubble. Now, we need to get to our point. We need to get to a point within our evolutionary process whereby we are not identifying with anything specific. Okay, you're not a shaman anymore, you're not an occultist anymore, you're not a mother anymore, you're not a son anymore, you're not a daughter anymore. Okay, you still have these roles there, but there is no binding to these roles. There is no sense of self that is being attached to these roles. In other words, you are embodying a state of ego elasticity. Okay, ego elasticity is not getting rid of the ego, it's acknowledging that your ego is necessary, but it's moving it into a more fluid form. Okay, a form that is more fluid, more adaptable. And this fluidity often means that your state of being is never going to be permanent in any way whatsoever. Okay, when somebody is embodying ego elasticity in their evolutionary path, their emotions are going to fluctuate like crazy. Okay, if you're on a real process of individuation, your emotions are going to fluctuate. This is the thing. Okay, you may feel one way, and then 5 minutes later you may feel a different way. And this is actually a very good sign because you're moving fluidly between your emotions. Okay, you're moving fluidly up and down that scale, and that is a sign that you are not in resistance. Okay, if you are in resistance to your own shadow, and you're in resistance and trying to hold on to this illusion of linearity onto this narcissistic bubble, then you're going to move into a space that feels more permanent, more safe to the ego, but in reality, you're not actually growing at all. You're not actually evolving at all. And therefore, you're bringing more of what you're avoiding into your reality unconsciously by identifying with the things that you think that you are avoiding, because avoidance is identification. So the ego elasticity is when you're fluctuating between different emotional states. And you're actually seeing that as a necessary aspect of your evolution because that fluidity, that elasticity is aligned to the soul. But it is a scary reality because you're shattering the illusion of permanence. You're shattering the illusion of linearity. You're shattering the illusion of this singular entity, and you're seeing through the hologram of identity. You're seeing through the hologram of self, and you're understanding that your vastness is so much more than this solid state. So then living within that state of consciousness, it's relentless. Doesn't stop. The evolution doesn't stop. You reach one state of being, you reach one state of attainment, you're there, beautiful, amazing. A few days later, you'll be in the next phase of your dissolution again. And then you'll welcome the dissolution, and then you'll move into the reconfiguration, the reconstruction, the new sense of self will build. And then it will be deconstructed again, shifted into something else. This is what true void consciousness is. Okay, void consciousness is not one thing. It is not a solid state. It is not the state of attainment. It is fluid. Every time you think that it is one thing, it will change into something else. trying to contain your own soul and bind it to a set bubble of who you think you are, or should I say, who you have learnt to feel safe as, is like trying to catch smoke. Your soul is always going to be pulling you towards a more fluid state of consciousness. And that fluid state of consciousness is the key to ongoing evolution. So the narcissistic bubble is an immensely dense trap that so many individuals fall into. So you're in a narcissistic bubble if you're in a constant state that is not changing at all. You're in a narcissistic bubble if you are trying to avoid vulnerability. You're in a narcissistic bubble if you're blaming spirits, if you're blaming other people, if you're blaming the world around you. You're in a narcissistic bubble if you're in this constant state of feeling good. You're in a narcissistic bubble if you're trying to keep unwanted things at bay. You are in a narcissistic bubble if you are trying to avoid fluidity and avoid the true nature of the soul, which is multiplicious. It is not one thing. That is why the narcissistic bubble is so dangerous, because it keeps you trapped. And when you are trapped within that state, you will either not grow at all and your existence will be hollow, or you will move into that space and maintain that space as long as possible, and then more chaos will unfold. Illness, external rupture, continuous perpetual relationship dynamics, continuous loneliness, continuous separation, whatever that may be. So acknowledge here that the narcissistic bubble is the aspect of you, the set of perceptual filters that is trying to maintain a reality that it sees as safe, but in the majority of cases, or in all cases, that is not actually serving you, because it's maintaining patterns, programs, and different things by trying to avoid them. To evolve, you have to be challenged. You have to be ruptured, and you have to understand your inner child and what the needs of your inner child actually are, and tailor your reality to meeting those needs and experiencing the opposite. This is real evolution. Evolution is not get to here and then that's it. Get to this state and then that's it. Does not exist. It is an illusion of stagnation. So I think that's everything that I need to speak about on this subject. Massive, massive subject, but very important to understand. So be sure to check out my Patreon, everybody. There is lots of information on my Patreon that is related to trauma integration and embodying this state of elasticity. But for now, thank you guys. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.